The rhythmic clatter of hooves on the cobbled road became a mournful drumbeat, each strike a measured step towards an unknown, inescapable future. Eleanor Vance sat perfectly still, within the confines of the somber, silent carriage, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The plush velvet seat, meant for comfort, felt instead like a velvet-lined trap, its deep crimson absorbing the last vestiges of the fading autumn light. A faint scent of old leather and damp wool clung to the air inside, a smell she knew she would forever associate with this journey, this final irreversible decision. She dared not look out the window, not yet. To witness the landscape blur past was to acknowledge the increasing distance from Vance Hall, from the life she had known, however imperfect it had become. Her father's locket, a small, intricately engraved silver piece, lay heavy against her collarbone, a cool, constant presence beneath the silk of her gown. It was tarnished now, like so much else from her past, but within its worn casing lay the faded miniature portrait of the man whose legacy had, in a way, led her to this moment. His eyes, even in miniature, held a glimmer of the pride she herself carried, a pride that now felt both a burden and her only shield. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over her, a weariness that went beyond the physical strain of travel. It was the weariness of a spirit asked to surrender, to bend to the harsh realities of debt and duty. Her mother, Evelyn Vance, was frail, her health failing under the weight of grief and financial ruin. Eleanor was the eldest, the one upon whom the burden had fallen, the one who had to choose between watching her family lose everything or sacrificing herself. The choice, in truth, had never been a choice at all. It was a stark, unavoidable path dictated by circumstance and the unyielding grip of their creditors. She focused on her breathing, trying to slow the frantic beat of her heart against her ribs. Each shallow breath felt constricted, as if the very air in the carriage was growing thicker, heavier. Her fingers, fine and slender, traced the faint scar above her left eyebrow, a childhood memory of a fall from a horse, a small rebellion against the perfectly polished image she was always expected to maintain. Now that small imperfection felt like a secret mark of her own resilience, a testament to surviving bumps and bruises. The carriage lurched slightly, a subtle shift in motion indicating a turn, perhaps onto a private drive. A new scent permeated the air, a blend of damp earth, distant wood smoke, and something else, something grand and formidable, like old stone and polished oak. She finally allowed her gaze to drift toward the window. Through the heavy glass, she saw towering wrought iron gates, ornate and imposing, already swinging open as if expecting her. They were a stark, formidable barrier between the world she was leaving and the one she was about to enter. The long, winding driveway stretched ahead, flanked by ancient, sentinel-like trees whose branches, now bare, clawed at the bruised autumn sky. Ashworth Manor emerged from the mist-laden distance, a sprawling dark edifice of stone that seemed to absorb the meager light. It did not invite, it commanded. Its very architecture spoke of centuries of wealth, power, and an unyielding cold authority. This was not a home. It was a fortress, a bastion of the Ashworth name, and now her gilded cage. A shiver ran down Eleanor's spine despite the thick traveling cloak wrapped around her. This cold was not from the air. It was a chill born of apprehension, a premonition of the emotional frost awaiting her. Her mind raced, a torrent of unspoken fears and grim resolutions. She had envisioned this moment countless times, rehearsing the polite responses, the stoic composure, the mask she would wear. But anticipation was one thing. The stark reality of it was another entirely. She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. The carriage rolled to a halt with a soft crunch of gravel, the sudden cessation of movement almost jarring after the long journey. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the snorting of the horses and the distant caw of a rook. This was it, the moment of reckoning. A footman, tall and stiff in a dark uniform, appeared at the carriage door, his presence a silent herald of her new status. He opened the door with a practiced, deferential movement, his face impassive. Eleanor took a deep, steadying breath, allowing a moment to gather her resolve. She smoothed the silk of her dress, adjusted the delicate lace at her cuffs, and forced a calm, almost serene expression onto her face. Pride was a formidable weapon, she reminded herself, and she would wield it with every ounce of strength she possessed. She stepped out, her boots sinking ever so slightly into the damp gravel. The air was cool, crisp, and carried the faint metallic tang of an approaching winter. Standing directly before the grand, oak-studded entrance of Ashworth Manor, a figure emerged from the shadowy recess of the archway. Lady Beatrice Ashworth, her new mother-in-law, stood perfectly still, a statuesque guardian of her domain. Her silver hair, meticulously styled into an unforgiving knot at the nape of her neck, gleamed even in the subdued light. Her features were sharp, refined, and set in an expression of unyielding severity. Her cold gray eyes, like chips of ice, swept over Eleanor from head to toe, a scrutiny so thorough it felt like a physical assessment. Eleanor met her gaze directly, refusing to flinch, refusing to offer any sign of vulnerability. She felt the raw, almost palpable weight of Lady Beatrice's judgment, the unspoken question of her worth hanging heavy in the air. This was the woman who had openly, if subtly, disparaged her family's fallen fortunes, who had made it clear she considered Eleanor an unsuitable match for her son. This was the woman whose every interaction with Eleanor, even before this day, had been laced with thinly veiled disdain. A faint scent of lavender, sharp and clean, emanated from Lady Beatrice, mingled with something else, a note of expensive, antique wood polish, perhaps. It was the smell of old money, of unshakable tradition, and of an unyielding will. Lady Beatrice's lips, thin and bloodless, barely parted as she offered her greeting. "Miss Vance." The words were clipped, precise, and devoid of any genuine warmth, her voice like the rustle of stiff silk, dry and cool. There was no welcome in her tone, only a bare acknowledgement of Eleanor's presence, an obligation fulfilled. Eleanor offered a polite, practiced curtsy, her movements graceful and composed. "Lady Beatrice," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her own heart. She felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach, a mixture of anger and a deep, aching sadness. This was her new family, her new reality. The disdain in Lady Beatrice's eyes was a stark confirmation of everything Eleanor had feared, every insult she had anticipated. She would have to armor herself, not just with pride, but with an impenetrable facade of indifference. Just then, a figure stepped forward from the shadow of the imposing doorway, almost as an afterthought. Lord Alistair Ashworth, her husband. He was tall, well-built, and impeccably dressed, his dark hair neatly combed, but his blue eyes, while piercing, held a distant, almost vacant quality. He carried a sheaf of papers in one hand, his thumb idly tracing the edge of the top sheet, his attention already elsewhere. Alistair offered a perfunctory nod, a shallow, almost imperceptible dip of his head that barely qualified as a greeting. "Eleanor Young," he murmured, his voice reserved, clipped, and utterly devoid of emotion. His gaze flickered over her for a fleeting moment, a brief, impersonal assessment, before returning swiftly to the documents in his hand. There was no warmth, no curiosity, no spark of anything that might suggest this was the woman he had just taken as his wife. He seemed more engrossed in the estate papers than in the living, breathing person standing before him. Eleanor felt a sharp, unexpected pang of disappointment, a foolish flutter of hope she hadn't realized she still possessed. She had known this would be a marriage of convenience, a transaction, but a small part of her, a foolish romantic sliver, had perhaps clung to the idea of some flicker of humanity, some shared understanding. Now, even that faint possibility dissolved into the chill autumn air. He was a stranger, and he intended to remain one. His indifference was a heavier burden than Lady Beatrice's outright hostility. Hostility could be fought, or at least withstood. Indifference simply hollowed one out. The polished marble of the grand entrance hall gleamed beneath her feet as she stepped across the threshold. The air inside was cool, carrying the faint, sterile scent of beeswax and old money, a smell that spoke of meticulous upkeep and a distant, almost forgotten past. Her footsteps echoed slightly in the vastness of the hall, a sound that felt lonely and small. Heavy tapestries depicting ancient hunting scenes adorned the high walls, their muted colors adding to the somber grandeur. A tall, ornate grandfather clock in the corner ticked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, measuring out the moments of her new, constrained existence. Eleanor felt the immense weight of the manor pressing down upon her, its vastness threatening to swallow her whole. The high ceilings, the imposing artwork, the silent, watchful staff who now faded into the periphery of her vision, they all contributed to an overwhelming sense of being an insignificant speck within a powerful, unyielding machine. This was her home now, a gilded cage forged from duty and desperation, a beautiful prison designed for a lonely soul. She stepped further into the echoing silence, a future of quiet despair stretching before her, as vast and cold as Ashworth Manor itself. The grand dining room, vast and silent save for the occasional clink of silver against porcelain, felt less like a place of nourishment and more like a stage. Eleanor sat at the long, polished mahogany table, the heavy silence pressing down on her like the ornate chandelier above. The rich scent of roasted pheasant and spiced wine filled the air, a stark contrast to the bitterness in her throat. She gripped her linen napkin, the fine embroidery digging into her palm, a small anchor in the rising tide of her anxiety. The heavy velvet curtains at the tall windows blocked out the last vestiges of twilight, plunging the room into an artificial glow from dozens of flickering candles. This was her new reality, a gilded cage where every breath felt observed, every movement judged. Lady Beatrice sat at the head of the table, her posture impeccably straight, her silver hair gleaming under the candlelight. Her cold gray eyes, sharp and assessing, occasionally flickered toward Eleanor before settling back on her own plate. There was an unspoken challenge in that gaze, a quiet contempt that Eleanor felt acutely, like a prickling sensation on her skin. Across from Eleanor, Lord Alistair Ashworth ate with a focused precision, his attention seemingly devoted to carving the meat on his plate. He offered no conversation, his presence a heavy, indifferent weight in the oppressive atmosphere. Eleanor had hoped, perhaps foolishly, for some small sign of warmth, a glance, a word, anything to alleviate the chilling isolation of her first dinner as a wife. She received only the steady rhythm of his fork against the ceramic, a sound that underscored his complete detachment. Eleanor tried to focus on the food, on the simple act of eating, but the rich flavors turned to ash in her mouth. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of dread. She felt the weight of her family's desperate circumstances, the knowledge that her presence here was a transaction, a sacrifice. Her father's face, etched with worry, flashed in her mind. He had asked her to be strong, to endure for their name, for their crumbling estate. She clutched the locket hidden beneath her gown, its familiar coolness a faint comfort against her racing pulse. It was a tangible link to her past, to a life that now felt impossibly distant, a life where laughter and genuine affection had once been commonplace. Lady Beatrice cleared her throat, a soft sound that nonetheless cut through the silence like a knife. It is always so interesting to see how different families adapt to new circumstances, she began, her voice smooth and deceptively mild. The Ashworths, of course, have held this land for generations, our fortunes unwavering. She paused, taking a slow sip of wine, her eyes now narrowed, briefly meeting Eleanor's. Some families, however, find themselves needing to be a bit more resourceful. The words hung in the air, light as a feather, yet heavy with unspoken meaning. Eleanor felt a burning flush creep up her neck, a wave of shame washing over her despite her attempts to fight it. Resourceful was a polite word for desperate, she knew. It was a thinly veiled jab at the Vance family's recent financial ruin, a reminder of the debt that had forced Eleanor into this very seat. Eleanor's grip tightened on her fork, her knuckles turning white. She forced a small, polite smile to her lips, though it felt like a grotesque mask. Her emerald eyes, usually so expressive, remained fixed on her plate, refusing to acknowledge the veiled insult. To look up would be to invite further scrutiny, to show that the barb had struck its mark. Her pride, her most cherished possession, felt under assault. She imagined her great-grandmother, a formidable woman of unwavering dignity, watching her from beyond. What would she say? Eleanor took a slow, measured breath, the scent of lavender from the centerpiece momentarily distracting her. She would not crack. She would not give Lady Beatrice the satisfaction. She risked a quick glance at Alistair. His head was still slightly bowed, his dark hair gleaming. He continued to eat, his movements precise and unhurried, as if the conversation, the tension, the very air around them did not exist. There was no flicker of understanding in his blue eyes, no offer of a protective word, not even a subtle acknowledgement of his mother's cruelty. He was an island, utterly detached, leaving Eleanor to weather the storm alone. A cold, hard knot formed in her stomach. She had known he was indifferent, pragmatic, but she had not anticipated the chilling absence of even basic courtesy. It was a deeper wound than the insult itself, a stark confirmation of her complete isolation within these opulent walls. Lady Beatrice continued, seemingly oblivious to the discomfort she was inflicting, or perhaps deriving pleasure from it. Indeed, it is a testament to resilience, would you not agree, Eleanor? To see estates that have fallen on hard times still manage to recover their standing through various means. Her smile was thin, almost predatory. It speaks volumes of character, certainly. The phrase "through various means" resonated with a particularly sharp sting. It implied Eleanor herself was merely a means, a transaction to restore her family's name, stripping her of any personal worth or agency. The warmth from the candles suddenly felt suffocating, and Eleanor's elegant gown, designed to impress, now felt like a heavy shroud. She felt the heat of her anger rising, a fierce, protective fire within her. How dare this woman diminish her family, her father's struggles, and her own sacrifice, all with such casual cruelty? Yet her years of training as a lady, her inherent sense of decorum, held her tongue captive. She could not lash out. It would only confirm Lady Beatrice's low opinion of her, validating the idea that her lineage was indeed inferior. She must remain composed, unyielding, a statue of quiet defiance. She focused on the delicate pattern of the china plate, tracing its curves with her eyes, her mind a whirlwind of hurt and indignation. The silver cutlery felt impossibly heavy in her hand. Alistair finally spoke, but not to Eleanor, nor in her defense. He addressed a servant who was refilling his wineglass. "A little more of the Bordeaux, if you please." His voice was calm, unremarkable, utterly devoid of any inflection that might suggest awareness of the verbal skirmish unfolding beside him. It was a mundane request, yet to Eleanor it felt like a deliberate act of dismissal, a clear statement that her feelings, her dignity, held no importance in this household. Her stomach churned, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to push her plate away, to stand up and simply walk out. But where would she go? Her family's home was crumbling, her mother dependent on this very union. She was trapped. The rest of the meal passed in a hazy blur of forced politeness and internal agony. Lady Beatrice continued to pepper the conversation with veiled remarks about family fortunes, the importance of good marriages, and the unfortunate circumstances of those who failed to secure their financial futures. Each word was a tiny, precisely aimed arrow, piercing Eleanor's composure, though she never let her facade falter. Her jaw ached from the effort of maintaining a pleasant, neutral expression. She nodded occasionally, offered monosyllabic responses when directly addressed, her voice calm and steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging within her. The food became tasteless, the wine bitter. When the meal finally concluded and Lady Beatrice rose from the table, a sense of profound relief washed over Eleanor. The air in the dining room, previously thick with unspoken animosity, now felt lighter, though the sting of the words remained. Eleanor offered a polite curtsy, her movements graceful and practiced, before retreating from the suffocating grandeur of the room. She felt utterly drained, as if she had just fought a silent, exhausting battle and barely survived. The weight of the world seemed to rest on her slender shoulders, a burden she alone had to bear. The long hallway leading to her chambers felt endless, each step a testament to her weariness. She finally reached her lavish yet cold chambers. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to a few glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the richly furnished room. The heavy drapes were already drawn, enclosing her in a cocoon of opulent solitude. She closed the large oak door behind her with a soft click, the sound echoing in the stillness. The silence in her room was different from the silence at dinner. It was not oppressive, but empty, devoid of human connection. She moved mechanically, shedding her formal gown, the heavy silk rustling around her like a sigh. She yearned for something familiar, something real, something that connected her to who she truly was, not this carefully constructed image of a dutiful wife. Her fingers went instinctively to her neck, tracing the delicate chain that held her locket. She pulled it out from beneath her chemise, the cool, smooth silver a welcome sensation against her skin. The locket was tarnished with age, a quiet testament to the many years it had been cherished. It contained a faded miniature portrait of her deceased father, his kind eyes looking out at her with a gentle, loving expression. She opened it, her thumb caressing the tiny image, a wave of profound sorrow washing over her. He had been a man of honor, who had loved her fiercely, and now she carried the weight of his legacy, his name, his hope. A single hot tear escaped her eye, tracing a path down her cheek. It was quickly followed by another and another, until silent sobs racked her body. She sank onto the edge of her large, ornate bed, the soft mattress yielding beneath her. She pressed the locket against her heart, the cool metal a stark contrast to the burning pain within her. The image of Alistair, impassively eating his dinner, refusing to meet her gaze, refusing to acknowledge her pain, replayed in her mind. His indifference was a deeper cut than any of Lady Beatrice's barbs. It was the crushing realization that she was truly alone in this grand, unforgiving house. She closed her eyes, the familiar scent of her father's faint cologne d'amour, somehow still clinging to the locket, filling her senses. It was a ghost of comfort, a whisper from a bygone era. How could she endure this? How could she face a lifetime of such subtle cruelty, such profound isolation? Her spirit felt bruised, her dignity shattered, yet a stubborn spark of defiance still flickered within her. She was a Vance, and Vances did not break easily. But the agony was real, a constant, gnawing presence. Eleanor clutched her locket, wondering how long she could bear this silent, agonizing torture without shattering. The morning light, pale and uncertain, filtered through the heavy damask curtains of Eleanor's room, doing little to dispel the lingering chill. She had spent a restless night, her fingers still imprinted with the cold metal of her locket, a small, stubborn anchor against the vast, empty sea of her new reality. Ashworth Manor felt less like a home and more like an elaborate, silent vault designed to preserve its own ancient, unyielding order. Yet, a flicker of her inherent resilience remained. She was not one to simply wither. She would find her place, she decided, even if that place felt carved from stone. Her early days in the manor had been a careful dance, each step measured, each word chosen. She observed the household staff with a quiet intensity, noticing the rhythm of their tasks, the subtle currents of their loyalties. The kitchen, for instance, operated with a certain antique inefficiency. The pantry, though vast, often seemed disorganized, requiring servants to spend precious minutes searching for specific provisions. Eleanor, having managed her own family's much smaller, yet meticulously run household, saw opportunities for improvement. She imagined streamlining the daily routines, bringing a quiet competence to the manor's operations, a way to contribute, to feel useful. One brisk Tuesday morning, Eleanor descended to the kitchen, a place she rarely visited, to find Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, directing a young scullery maid with an air of weary resignation. Mrs. Gable was a woman with kind, though perpetually tired, eyes and hands roughened by decades of service. Eleanor approached her with a gentle smile, a rare offering in the sterile halls of Ashworth. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable," Eleanor began, her voice soft but clear. "I was wondering if I might offer a small suggestion regarding the storage of the dry goods." Mrs. Gable paused, her brow furrowing slightly, a flicker of surprise in her gaze. No one in this household offered suggestions, least of all the lady of the manor. "Lady Eleanor," she replied, her tone polite but reserved, "we have always managed adequately." Eleanor understood the unspoken sentiment. This is how things are done here. "Of course," Eleanor acknowledged, her smile not wavering, "and you do so admirably. but perhaps a simple system of labeling the shelves or arranging the flour and sugar in more accessible containers could save time during the busy morning preparations. She pointed to a high shelf where several sacks of grain were precariously stacked. It might prevent unnecessary strain for the younger girls. Mrs. Gable considered this, her eyes darting to the offending shelf, then back to Eleanor. A faint hint of interest, or perhaps just polite consideration, touched her face. "That is a thought, Lady Eleanor," she conceded, slowly. "I suppose it might indeed save a few steps." For a brief moment, Eleanor felt a tiny spark of connection, a sense of purpose. She had offered a practical solution, and it had been received, however cautiously. However, the fragile truce of potential collaboration was short-lived. That afternoon, as Eleanor was sketching a design for a more efficient spice rack, Lady Beatrice swept into the drawing room, her presence instantly chilling the air. She did not look at Eleanor directly, but addressed the room at large, her voice sharp and distinct. "I was just speaking with Mrs. Gable," she announced, her words like finely honed blades. "It seems there are new ideas circulating about how our household should be run. One must always be wary of innovations that disrupt established order. Tradition, after all, is the bedrock of any reputable household." Eleanor's hand paused, her pencil hovering above the paper. She felt the sudden, familiar flush creep up her neck, a hot wave of mortification. Lady Beatrice did not need to name her directly. The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mrs. Gable, Eleanor knew, would have been rebuked, perhaps subtly threatened, for entertaining such notions. Her small, hopeful offering had been twisted into an act of impertinence, a challenge to the established matriarchal authority. Eleanor swallowed hard, forcing her hand to continue sketching. Though her lines became rigid, angry, her throat tightened, a bitter taste filling her mouth. She had wanted to help, to simply belong, but her efforts were seen as an intrusion, a foreign body rejected by the manor's formidable immune system. A week later, Eleanor found herself drawn to the manor's neglected rose garden. It was a beautiful space, though overgrown, its potential clear beneath layers of wild growth. The trellises sagged, and many of the more delicate varieties were choked by aggressive weeds. She envisioned a vibrant, fragrant haven, a splash of color against the manor's somber stone. She sought out Mr. Finch, the head gardener, a quiet man with soil permanently embedded beneath his fingernails. She spoke to him of pruning techniques, of companion planting, of bringing certain heirloom varieties back to their former glory. Mr. Finch listened with a respectful attentiveness, his eyes lighting up at the mention of particular roses he remembered from his youth. "Lady Eleanor understands roses," he had murmured, a rare compliment that warmed her. But again, the chilling hand of Lady Beatrice reached out. The very next day, as Eleanor walked through the garden, she saw a cluster of new saplings, hastily planted, not where she had suggested, but in a barren, shaded corner where they would surely struggle. Mr. Finch, avoiding her gaze, busied himself with a distant task. Later, she overheard Lady Beatrice discussing the garden with a visiting relative. "One must resist the urge to meddle with nature too much," she remarked, her voice dripping with saccharine disapproval. "A garden, like a family, thrives on careful, conservative management, not on impulsive, untested whims." Eleanor felt the sting of the words, sharp and targeted. Her ideas, her genuine desire to contribute, were being systematically, patiently suffocated. Each attempt to find a foothold, to carve out a purpose within the Ashworth walls, was met with this quiet, unyielding resistance. She was not meant to improve things. She was merely meant to exist, a decorative, silent fixture. The weight of her uselessness pressed down on her, a heavy, invisible cloak. She felt like an outsider, always watching, always excluded, her presence an inconvenience rather than an asset. Her isolation was not confined to the household staff. Lord Alistair Ashworth, her husband, remained a distant, imposing figure, seemingly oblivious to her presence, or perhaps willfully ignoring it. His days were a precise schedule of estate matters, meetings with his bailiff, inspections of tenant farms, reviews of ledgers, correspondence with solicitors. He rode out each morning after a silent breakfast, his posture rigid, his expression set. He returned late in the afternoon, often covered in dust or mud, only to disappear into his study, the heavy oak door closing with a definitive thud. Eleanor tried initially to bridge the growing chasm between them. During the sparse, formal dinners, she would attempt conversation, carefully selecting topics she thought might interest him. "Alistair," she began one evening, her voice perhaps a shade too bright, "I saw the new planting in the North Fields today. It looks quite promising." He did not look up from his plate, methodically cutting his roast. "Indeed," he replied, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. "It should yield a good crop." She tried again a few nights later, sensing his preoccupation with a stack of documents beside his plate. "Is there anything pressing you are working on, my lord?" she inquired gently. "Perhaps I could assist in some small way." Alistair finally raised his eyes, but his gaze was vacant, as if he looked through her, not at her. "No, Eleanor," he stated, his tone betraying no malice, only a profound disinterest. "These are estate matters. They require my full attention." He returned to his meal, the brief exchange ending as abruptly as it had begun. Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was not rejection, not outright cruelty, but something far more devastating. Utter indifference. Her words, her presence, made no impression. She was a ghost at her own table, a silent observer in her own life. She would sometimes find herself lingering near his study door, hearing the scratch of his pen, the rustle of papers, the low murmur of his voice with a servant. A desperate longing for connection would bloom in her chest, a foolish, persistent hope that he might call out to her, invite her in, share a thought, even a mundane one, Chiffren. But the door remained stubbornly closed, a solid barrier between their two separate worlds. Her attempts to engage him felt like casting pebbles into a vast, silent lake, creating barely a ripple. He existed in his world of facts and figures, and she, in hers, a world increasingly devoid of anything at all. As the weeks bled into months, Eleanor found herself spending more and more time alone in her room. The lavishness of her chambers, once a symbol of her sacrifice, now felt like a cruel mockery. The silken tapestries, the heavy velvet drapes, the polished mahogany furniture, they were all magnificent, yet utterly devoid of warmth. The room echoed with silence, a vast, oppressive quiet that pressed in on her ears, amplifying the emptiness within. She would sit for hours by the window, a book open on her lap, but her eyes rarely focused on the words. Instead, she stared out at the sprawling, manicured lawns, the distant line of trees, the unchanging landscape of Ashworth. The world outside her window seemed vibrant, alive, while her own existence felt still and suffocated. She missed the lively chatter of Vance Hall, the comfortable, if chaotic presence of her mother, the intellectual debates with her father that had often stretched late into the night. She yearned for genuine conversation, for the quick wit and shared laughter she had once known. Her fingers would often trace the delicate curves of her locket, a tangible link to a past that felt increasingly distant, almost imagined. Her father had been a man of immense curiosity, his library a sanctuary of knowledge and spirited discussion. He had encouraged her to read widely, to form her own opinions, to engage with the world around her. Here at Ashworth, her opinions were dismissed, her engagement unwanted. She often thought of the letters she used to exchange with her dearest friend Sarah, filled with observations and confidences. Now she wrote letters in her head, eloquent, passionate letters that would never be put to paper, never sent, never read. The silence of the manor became a constant companion, a heavy blanket that smothered any spark of joy or initiative. She would walk the long corridors, her footsteps echoing unnervingly loud, feeling like a stranger in her own home. The portraits on the walls, stern and unsmiling, seemed to judge her, their painted eyes following her every movement, reminding her of the lineage she had married into, the expectations she was failing to meet. She tried to find solace in the manor's extensive library, hoping to lose herself in stories, in history, in poetry. But even the words on the page seemed to blur, her mind constantly returning to her own predicament, the gnawing ache of her isolation. Sometimes she would find herself simply standing in the middle of her opulent room, her arms wrapped around herself, a profound emptiness settling deep in her bones. The air, though warm from the hearth, felt cold against her skin. She longed for a touch, a kind glance, a simple acknowledgement that she was more than just the silent, decorative wife of Lord Ashworth. The silence often felt more crushing than any spoken insult. An insult, at least, acknowledged her existence. This indifference, this profound neglect, made her feel as though she were slowly, imperceptibly fading away. The weight of her duty, the memory of her mother's fragile health, and the Vance family's looming debts was the only thing that kept her tethered to this joyless existence. She was here for a purpose, a grim, necessary sacrifice. Yet the cost felt immeasurable. Each day was a testament to her endurance, but also a slow erosion of her spirit. She had traded the warmth of her past, the vibrant tapestry of her intellect and affections, for the cold, hard currency of security, and the exchange was proving to be devastating. Her nights were often sleepless, her mind replaying snippets of happier times, conversations with her mother, the sound of her father's laughter, the familiar, comforting chaos of Vance Hall. These memories were bittersweet, providing a brief respite from the present, but ultimately deepening the pang of loss. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage surrounded by opulence, yet starved of genuine human connection. The Ashworth Manor, with its grand facade and cold, hollow heart, was slowly consuming her, leaving behind only a shell. One particularly dreary afternoon, with rain lashing against the window panes, Eleanor stood by her window, her gaze fixed on the sprawling, indifferent grounds of Ashworth Manor. The ancient trees swayed in the wind, their branches dark and bare. The formal hedges stood rigid, unyielding. The very landscape seemed to mirror her internal state, vast, orderly, beautiful in its own stark way, but utterly devoid of warmth or welcome. She felt a profound ache of solitude, a stark contrast to the lively home she once knew. The sprawling grounds of Ashworth Manor held a chilling beauty, especially under the soft, discerning gaze of the moon. Eleanor often walked the winding paths in the late evenings, seeking solace in the cool air, in the distant whisper of the wind through the ancient oaks. Each night the silence of the vast estate pressed upon her, a constant reminder of her solitude within its grand, indifferent walls. She traced the delicate outline of a rose petal, its edges cool and dewy beneath her fingertip, a stark contrast to the burning ache in her chest. The scent of 1,000 blooms, heavy and sweet, filled the air, yet it could not mask the faint metallic tang of her own quiet desperation. She often felt like a ghost haunting her own life, a silent observer of a fate she could not escape. One particular evening, the air was unusually still, the moonlight casting long, dancing shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges. Eleanor found herself drawn towards the rose garden, its intricate patterns of familiar comfort. Her silk gown rustled softly with each step, the only sound breaking the profound quiet. Then a faint sound, the crunch of gravel underfoot, made her pause. Her breath hitched in her throat, a sudden, unexpected tension seizing her. She had been so accustomed to her solitary wanderings, the sudden presence of another felt like an intrusion, or perhaps a fleeting promise. Alistair emerged from the deeper shadows, his figure tall and unyielding, even in the moon's gentle glow. He moved with the quiet purpose that marked his every action, his hands clasped behind his back. Eleanor's heart gave a strange, unwelcome flutter, a tiny bird trapped against her ribs. He was not often found outside his study or the formal drawing rooms, and certainly not in the gardens at this hour. Their paths rarely intersected outside of the strict routines of meals and social obligations, which only emphasized her profound isolation within his home. She prepared herself for his usual curt nod or a distant, formal inquiry about her health. He stopped beside a climbing rose, its blossoms a cascade of deep crimson, almost black in the muted light. For a long moment he simply stood there, his profile stark against the silvered landscape. Eleanor watched him, mesmerized by the sheer anomaly of the moment. His usual preoccupation seemed to fall away, replaced by an unfamiliar stillness. A strange sense of anticipation coiled in her stomach, a feeling she had almost forgotten how to experience. She found herself holding her breath, waiting for some unknown word, some flicker of recognition. Then, his voice, low and surprisingly soft, broke the stillness. The roses are quite striking tonight, are they not? He did not look at her, his gaze remaining fixed on the velvet petals. His words, though simple, carried an unexpected resonance in the quiet night. The formality usually coating his speech seemed to soften, almost imperceptibly. It was a mere observation, yet it felt like a fragile bridge extended across the vast chasm that separated them. Eleanor felt a jolt, a warmth spreading through her veins, entirely unbidden and unwelcome. His comment was brief, almost an afterthought, yet it struck Eleanor with the force of a sudden revelation. She found herself unable to speak, her throat tight. He had never before offered such a casual, almost aesthetic observation to her. His world was one of ledgers and estate management, of duty and lineage, rarely one of beauty for its own sake. A tiny, dangerous tendril of hope began to unfurl within her, fragile as a spider's silk in the morning dew. Could there be a crack in his formidable emotional armor? Could there be a hidden chamber within him, capable of appreciating something beyond the purely utilitarian? Eleanor felt a foolish, dizzying lightness in her chest. She had spent weeks, months, feeling invisible, a necessary fixture in his grand house, but never truly seen. This simple sentence, spoken in the soft embrace of moonlight, was a sudden recognition, a momentary acknowledgement of shared space, shared existence. Her fingers tightened on the skirt of her gown, a silent anchor against the sudden, tumultuous current of emotion. She wanted to ask him more, to draw out this elusive moment, to test the boundaries of this unexpected reprieve from his usual indifference. The thought, however, died on her lips. She feared shattering the fragile peace, breaking the spell. What if her words chased away this fleeting glimpse of a different Alistair? She simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. The cool night air felt suddenly warmer on her skin. She imagined for a split second a life where such moments were not rare anomalies, but quiet, comfortable constants. A life where her husband might truly see her, and not just the arrangements she represented. The idea was intoxicating, yet she knew it was a dangerous fantasy. He turned then, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths before he offered another small nod, a mere acknowledgement. Then, without another word, he continued his path, disappearing back into the deeper shadows of the garden, leaving her standing alone amidst the fragrant roses. The warmth that had bloomed in her chest began to recede, a cold reality seeping back in to fill the void. He had come and gone like a silent apparition, leaving behind only the lingering scent of roses and the ghost of a shared moment. Eleanor remained there for a long time, the moon slowly traversing its arc across the sky. She replayed his words in her mind, turning them over and over like precious, fragile jewels. The roses are quite striking tonight. Was it merely an observation or something more? Her heart yearned for the latter, even as her rational mind scoffed at her own naivety. This was Alistair, the man who saw marriage as a transaction, not a partnership of hearts. He was the man who had dismissed her with silent indifference for weeks. Yet, the memory of his softened voice, the slight tilt of his head towards the roses, held a potent, dangerous allure. She walked back to her chambers, the manor now feeling even colder, more cavernous than before. The brief encounter had stirred a forgotten hunger within her, a yearning for connection that she had diligently tried to suppress. Her sleep that night was fitful, haunted by the image of moonlit roses and the soft murmur of his voice. She found herself clinging to the memory, a lifeline in the vast, empty sea of her existence. Perhaps, she thought, perhaps there was a chance for something more than mere cohabitation. Perhaps, beneath the veneer of indifference, lay a man capable of warmth, of genuine feeling. It was a foolish hope, she knew, but in the suffocating emptiness of her days, even a foolish hope felt like a fragile, precious gift. The next morning, the grand dining room was bathed in the harsh, unforgiving light of a new day. The delicate illusions of the night had vanished, replaced by the stark reality of polished silver and stern faces. Eleanor descended the wide staircase, a faint tremor of nervous anticipation fluttering within her. She had dressed with a little more care, choosing a gown of soft green that she hoped might catch his eye, a small, secret act of hope. She tried to project an air of calm composure, despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. Lady Beatrice was already seated, her cold gray eyes sweeping over Eleanor with their usual critical appraisal. The air was thick with the familiar scent of strong coffee and the unspoken weight of expectations. Eleanor took her seat opposite Alistair, her gaze instinctively drawn to him. He was, as always, meticulously dressed, his dark hair neatly combed. He was engrossed in the morning newspaper, a large, rustling sheet that formed a barrier between himself and the world. His presence was formidable, yet entirely distant, a familiar, painful tableau. Eleanor cleared her throat softly, a small attempt to break the oppressive silence. She poured herself a cup of tea, the delicate porcelain cup feeling suddenly heavy in her hand. Her heart pounded a quiet rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of foolish expectation. She waited, a small, hopeful smile playing on her lips, ready to meet his gaze, ready for some small sign of recognition, perhaps a shared glance that acknowledged their unusual encounter the previous night. She longed for a flicker of that earlier, softer demeanor. He turned a page of the newspaper with a crisp, decisive sound. He did not look up. The moment stretched, growing taut with her unspoken hopes. Eleanor felt a blush creeping up her neck, a mortifying awareness of her own vulnerability. The image of the moonlit roses, the soft murmur of his voice, seemed to mock her from the distant recesses of her memory. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea, trying to regain her composure, to quell the rising tide of disappointment. Finally, as if sensing her presence through the barrier of newsprint, he lowered the paper slightly. His blue eyes, usually so keen, held no particular warmth, no lingering trace of their shared evening. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, then offered a brief, almost perfunctory nod. It was the same dismissive gesture he had given her countless times before, devoid of any special meaning, any acknowledgement of the prior night's momentary reprieve. It was a polite, distant formality, a gesture of profound indifference. The small, hopeful smile that had lingered on Eleanor's lips faltered, then died. The fleeting warmth that had enveloped her in the garden, the tender whisper of his words, dissipated like morning mist under the harsh glare of the sun. It left her feeling colder, more exposed than before. Her breath caught, a sharp, physical pain in her chest. The brief hope she had dared to entertain shattered into 1,000 tiny, agonizing fragments. She felt a bitter surge of self-reproach. How could she have been so foolish? How could she have allowed herself to be swayed by a single, casual remark, a momentary anomaly in his otherwise unyielding detachment? Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the teacup back on its saucer. She felt a profound sense of disillusionment wash over her, a heavier, more crushing weight than any of Lady Beatrice's open slights. It was the weight of her own self-deception. The morning light, which had promised warmth, now felt chilling, exposing the raw wound of her renewed despair. She questioned her own perceptions, her own sanity. Had she imagined the tenderness in his voice? Had her desperate longing for connection conjured a moment that never truly existed? The man across the table, engrossed once more in his newspaper, was the same remote, indifferent husband she had always known. The brief interlude in the moonlit garden felt like a cruel trick of her own mind, a phantom limb of hope that had now been brutally severed. The whispers started as soon as Eleanor stepped into the grand ballroom. A low hum of polite conversation fell into scattered murmurs, eyes sliding towards her, then quickly away. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk, a color she thought elegant, understated, perfectly suited for the Ashworth's annual autumn reception. Yet the moment her gaze met Lady Beatrice's, a cold dread began to coil in her stomach. Her mother-in-law stood by the grand fireplace, a glass of sherry held delicately in her hand, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. The scent of polished wood and expensive perfumes filled the air, thick and cloying. Eleanor walked towards the receiving line, her back straight, a practiced, serene smile fixed upon her face. She felt the weight of every gaze, the silent scrutiny like tiny needles pricking her skin. Her hands, usually so steady, felt a faint tremble within her white kid gloves. She extended her hand to the first guest, a distant cousin of Alistair's, offering a polite greeting. Then Lady Beatrice's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the genteel chatter. "Eleanor, my dear, you truly chose bravely tonight." The words hung in the air, a bell tolling a judgment. Eleanor felt a hot flush creep up her neck, but her smile did not falter. She turned towards Our Lady Beatrice, her emerald eyes meeting the cold gray ones of her mother-in-law. "Bravely, Lady Beatrice?" Eleanor asked, her voice calm, a carefully constructed fortress of composure. "I thought the sapphire quite fitting for the season." Lady Beatrice let out a soft, dismissive chuckle, her gaze sweeping over Eleanor's gown, lingering on the delicate lace trim. "Oh, the color is certainly a choice. But the cut, darling, so simple. One might almost mistake it for something from a rather less established household." Her eyes flickered pointedly toward Mrs. Albright, the wife of a wealthy but new merchant standing nearby. Mrs. Albright stiffened, her own elaborate gown suddenly seeming to shrink under the implied comparison. Eleanor's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her fingers locked around the small fan she carried, the ivory sticks digging into her palm. She knew Lady Beatrice intended for every prominent guest present to hear this subtle, yet devastating, insult. The humiliation burned, a slow, insidious fire, threatening to consume her carefully cultivated poise. She could almost taste the acrid sting of tears behind her eyes, but she would not let them fall. Not here, not now. Giving Lady Beatrice that satisfaction was unthinkable. She inhaled slowly, the scent of the dying embers in the fireplace a faint, smoky comfort. "Indeed," Eleanor replied, her voice unwavering. "I find simplicity often holds an elegance of its own, Lady Beatrice. A quiet dignity, perhaps, that does not always require elaborate display." She met her mother-in-law's gaze with a steady, unyielding defiance. A flicker of surprise, almost anger, crossed Lady Beatrice's face, quickly masked by her usual disdain. Alistair, standing beside his mother, merely cleared his throat, his attention seemingly fixed on a landscape painting across the room. He offered no word of defense, no glance of sympathy, his indifference a heavier weight than his mother's barbs. Eleanor felt a familiar ache of disappointment, a dull, throbbing pain that resonated deep within her. He was a silent accomplice in her public shaming, his presence a stark reminder of her isolated position. The air in the ballroom seemed to thicken, the forced gaiety of the guests suddenly feeling brittle and false. Later that evening, as the reception was in full swing, Lady Beatrice called for Eleanor. The grand hall, usually reserved for formal entrances, was being prepared for a large floral display, the center of attention for the following day's charitable luncheon. Dozens of cut flowers lay scattered across a long table, their sweet fragrance a stark contrast to the bitter taste in Eleanor's mouth. "Eleanor, my dear," Lady Beatrice purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "The head gardener has quite unfortunately been taken ill, a rather inconvenient bout of the chills, and the staff are, of course, entirely preoccupied with the supper preparations." She gestured towards the profusion of blooms, roses, lilies, chrysanthemums, awaiting arrangement. "You have such an eye for beauty, I recall. Perhaps you would be so kind as to oversee the arrangement of these rather crucial centerpieces." Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. Arranging flowers was a task for the household staff, for the junior housemaids, or a skilled florist. Certainly not for the mistress of the house, especially not with so many guests still lingering, their conversations ebbing and flowing around her. Her cheeks burned with renewed shame, a deeper crimson than before. This was not a subtle jab. This was an open, blatant degradation, designed to publicly relegate her to a servant's role. She saw Lord Harrington, a family friend from her childhood, pause at the edge of the hall, his eyes widening slightly as he registered Lady Beatrice's request. A fierce battle raged within Eleanor. Every fiber of her being screamed to refuse, to walk away, to reclaim her dignity with a sharp retort. But her pride, that same stubborn, unyielding pride, demanded something else. It demanded stoicism, a refusal to break, a refusal to give Lady Beatrice the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She would not provide entertainment for the gossiping tongues. She would not let them see her weakness. She would not be broken. "Of course, Lady Beatrice," Eleanor replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil churning inside her. She felt her hands clench, then slowly relax. She walked towards the table laden with flowers, her silk gown rustling softly, a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet of the hall. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and crushed petals, a smell that brought a sudden, unexpected wave of homesickness for Vance Hall. She picked up a long-stemmed white lily, its petals pristine and unblemished. Her fingers, usually so adept at embroidery or playing the pianoforte, felt clumsy, alien, as she began to trim the stem. The cool, damp feel of the flower against her skin was a small, grounding sensation. She heard the murmurs intensify, the low whispers dissecting the scene, analyzing her every move. She felt the curious, pitying, and sometimes disdainful glances of the guests. Each snip of the shears, each placement of a rose, was an act of quiet defiance. Her back remained straight, her head held high, her expression calm, though her jaw felt impossibly tight. Her vision swam a little at the edges, a testament to the immense self-control she was exerting. The vibrant colors of the flowers seemed to mock her internal monochrome of despair. She focused on the task, trying to empty her mind, to silence the clamor of self-pity and anger. She began to arrange the flowers with an almost surgical precision, creating elegant, balanced displays, drawing upon the skills she had learned as a young girl, helping her own mother with their garden's bounty. Each bloom was a silent scream, each arrangement a silent protest against the injustice of her position. Her hands moved with a grace that belied the turmoil within her. The sweet perfume of the flowers began to fill the hall, a cruel irony against the bitterness in her soul. Hours passed. The last of the guests had departed, leaving the manor in a hushed silence broken only by the distant sounds of servants tidying up. Eleanor stood amidst the completed arrangements, a beautiful, fragrant tableau of her humiliation. Her shoulders ached, her back was stiff, and her eyes felt gritty. But the most profound ache was in her heart, a deep, bruising pain that settled heavily in her chest. Lady Beatrice, passing by on her way to retire, paused. She surveyed the exquisite arrangements, a small, almost imperceptible smirk playing on her lips. "Excellent, Eleanor," she said, her voice devoid of any genuine warmth. "You have indeed proven surprisingly capable." With a rustle of silk, she was gone, leaving Eleanor alone in the vast, silent hall, surrounded by the fragrant evidence of her degradation. Eleanor stood for a long moment, the scent of roses and lilies filling her lungs, a heavy, suffocating perfume. The perfect arrangements seemed to mock her, standing as monuments to her silent suffering. The last vestiges of her strength felt drained, leaving her hollow and brittle. Her composure, so fiercely maintained, threatened to shatter into 1,000 pieces. She felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to escape the suffocating walls of Ashworth Manor, to shed the oppressive weight of her forced existence. Her steps were heavy as she ascended the grand staircase, the silence of the manor pressing in on her, amplifying the echoes of Lady Beatrice's words. Each step was a battle against the crushing despair that threatened to overwhelm her. The plush carpets felt like quicksand, pulling her deeper into the abyss of her misery. She reached her chambers, the lavish room now feeling like a gilded cage, a prison adorned with silk and velvet. The door closed softly behind her, sealing her within the confines of her pain. She moved mechanically, her fingers fumbling with the tiny buttons at the back of her sapphire gown. The silk felt heavy, a burden rather than a garment. She shed the dress, letting it fall in a crumpled heap on the floor, a symbol of the evening's torment. Her gaze fell upon her dressing table where the small, intricately engraved silver locket lay. It was tarnished with age, its surface dull compared to the glittering jewels of Ashworth Manor, but it held more value to her than all the wealth in the house. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as they closed around the cool metal. The locket was her only tangible link to her past, to her family, to the father she had adored, a reminder of who she was before this life of endless humiliation. Tears, long held back, finally began to blur her vision, hot and stinging as they traced paths down her cheeks. The humiliation burned anew, a fire threatening to consume her last vestiges of self-worth. Lady Beatrice's words clung to Eleanor like a shroud, a burning sting in the silence of her chambers. Each deliberate slight, each public humiliation, drained her spirit, leaving a hollow ache that throbbed with every beat. She paced the polished floor, her silk gown rustling softly, the only sound in the vast, indifferent manor. The air felt heavy, suffocating her. Her fingers found the locket at her throat, its cool metal a small comfort. Grief threatened to break her composure as she remembered her father's kind smile, his gentle strength. His faded face in the locket reminded her of all she lost, all she endured. A quiet knock startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. A footman, impassive, stood in the doorway, holding a silver tray with a single cream-colored envelope. Eleanor's breath hitched. This was not the usual correspondence. This felt personal, an unfamiliar hand, yet deeply familiar. She took the letter, her fingers brushing the stiff paper, a subtle tremor running through her. The footman bowed silently and retreated, leaving her in the echoing solitude of her opulent prison. She turned the envelope over, her eyes tracing the script of her mother's handwriting. Mrs. Evelyn Vance. Her mother's name, imperfectly formed, brought a sudden longing for Vance Hall. Her mother rarely wrote, usually sending brief, cheerful notes. This letter, however, felt different, heavier. Foreboding settled in her heart. She almost smelled her mother's lavender and old books, a phantom aroma in Ashworth Manor's sterile air. With a hesitant sigh, Eleanor broke the seal, the paper tearing with a soft ripping sound. She unfolded the single sheet, her eyes scanning the familiar lines. The script, usually neat and elegant, was slightly shaky, the loops less steady, the words leaning to the right. A knot tightened in Eleanor's stomach. Her mother never trembled, even amidst their mounting misfortunes. This subtle change spoke volumes. The opening lines were customary, inquiring about her well-being. But as Eleanor's gaze moved down the page, the tone shifted, growing troubled. Her mother spoke of poor harvests, the soil uncooperative. The dry spell was longer than anticipated, she wrote. The ground had turned to parched, cracked earth. Eleanor remembered Vance Hall's fields, how green they had been, wheat swaying like golden oceans. Now she saw them withered, brittle, a reflection of her family's fortunes. Then came the numbers, small, precise, devastating. The costs of the new roof, still incomplete from winter storms, were exorbitant. Wages for the few remaining estate workers, men who served their family, were difficult to meet. Her mother wrote of selling more heirloom silver, pieces adorning their table for centuries, to cover urgent expenses. Each item sold took a piece of their history, a fragment of dignity. Eleanor's breath grew shallow. Cold dread seeped into her. She practically heard the clink of metal, the shameful transactions taking place at Vance Hall. Her mother's words painted a picture of relentless financial strain. She spoke of encroaching debts, not with panic, but weary resignation that chilled her. The creditors grow bolder, dearest Eleanor, the letter read, and their patience wears thinner with each passing month. Eleanor saw her mother at the old writing desk, her brow furrowed with worry, stooped under responsibilities. The faint scent of Vance Hall, a ghost of her childhood home, rose from the paper. The letter continued, and a profound unease prickled her skin. Her mother made several passing mentions of her own health, disguised in everyday observations. A persistent cough lingered after winter. A weariness settled in her bones, making tasks burdensome. My energy is not what it once was, she wrote with a lightness that felt false in an attempt to spare her worry. These old bones ache more than they should, and the chill often finds its way into them. Eleanor's vision blurred, a wave of fear washing over her. She knew her mother, knew her quiet stoicism. For Mrs. Vance to mention discomfort, however subtly, meant it was significant, alarming. Her mother would collapse before complaining, carrying burdens in silence. The thought of her mother, frail and alone, struggling with the decaying estate and unseen illness, sent panic through Eleanor. She gripped the letter tighter, its edges crinkling. The paper felt rough, abrasive, a physical manifestation of the harsh reality. The next paragraph was a delicate, heartbreaking plea, woven between love and gratitude. I find myself relying more and more on the kindness of others, dearest, her mother confessed, and indeed on your tireless efforts. There was the unspoken truth, the heavy implication. Eleanor's mother, fiercely independent, admitted her dependency. Failing health and financial drain eroded her self-sufficiency, forcing her to lean on the daughter she sacrificed. The words hammered at Eleanor, each syllable a fresh wound. Your marriage, Eleanor, her mother continued, Her penmanship grew more unsteady here. It was truly a blessing, was it not? Without your strength, your courage, I do not know how we would manage. The praise felt like a whip, lashing her raw pride. A blessing? Her gilded cage, daily humiliations, her husband's cold indifference, her mother-in-law's cruel scorn. Was this a blessing? The irony was a bitter, metallic taste. Yet she knew her mother meant every word, understood the profound sacrifice she made. Her mother believed Eleanor found a stable existence, her own precarious position cushioned by the marriage. The letter subtly emphasized Eleanor's irreplaceable role. Her mother's survival hinged on Eleanor's presence in Ashworth Manor, on the financial stability her marriage provided. Eleanor was not merely a daughter, she was the linchpin, the sole support, her mother's very breath. Every word underscored her obligation, a burden heavier than any task. She pictured her mother's tired face, her kind blue eyes, now shadowed with worry, and a profound ache settled in her chest. The quiet ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to mock her, counting down her dwindling freedom, her inevitable fate. A single tear escaped Eleanor's eye, tracing a hot path down her cheek, a stark contrast to her usual composure. It was not self-pity, but raw, agonizing helplessness. She had married Alistair to save her family, to lift the burden from her mother's shoulders. She had believed, foolishly, that her sacrifice would be enough, that her suffering would spare her mother. But the letter was a cruel awakening, a blunt reminder her agony was not isolated. Her suffering was inextricably tied to her mother's survival, her well-being. The walls of Ashworth Manor, once merely imposing, now felt hostile, closing in. The tapestries, heavy furniture, cold fireplace, symbols of wealth, mocked her. They reminded her of golden chains. Escape, a fleeting fantasy, now seemed utterly impossible. How could she leave? How could she abandon her mother, frail and struggling, at the mercy of creditors and failing health? The thought was a betrayal, a cruelty she could never inflict. Her dignity, her happiness, became secondary to her mother's survival. She reread the lines, her eyes lingering on the shaky handwriting. Each word burned into her memory. I pray for your happiness, my dearest girl, always, and I rest easy knowing you are safe, provided for. Safe? Provided for? The bitter irony made her want to scream at the injustice. She was safe in a gilded cage, provided for by those who dismantled her spirit. Her heart felt like a raw nerve, throbbing with despair and protective love for her mother. The old paper's faint, ghostly scent of Vance Hall mingled with Ashworth's sterile grandeur, a sensory dissonance mirroring her turmoil. Eleanor closed her eyes, pressing the letter to her forehead, feeling the faint ink, the paper's texture. She saw her mother's face, etched with worry, softened by love. She pictured her mother alone in Vance Hall, the vast rooms growing colder, the gardens wilder, neglect deepening. The image solidified her resolve, hardening the shell around her heart. Her misery, her humiliation, was a price she had to pay. It was a tax on her mother's continued existence, a necessary evil in a cruel world. A profound weariness settled over Eleanor, a bone-deep exhaustion beyond mere sleep. It was the weariness of a spirit under siege, enduring endless battles with no respite. She lowered the letter, her hand trembled so violently the paper quivered, threatening to slip. She tried to steady herself, but her fingers lost their strength, her control abandoned her. The cream-colored sheet, with its devastating news, fluttered from her grasp. It drifted slowly to the polished floor, settling silently beside her feet like a fallen leaf. Her suffering was a necessary sacrifice, locking her further into her gilded prison. The heavy gilded letter from her mother lay crumpled on the silk coverlet. Eleanor watched it from across the room, its very presence a physical weight pressing down on her chest. The words within, delicate and scrawled, seemed to burn themselves into her memory. I am unwell, my dearest girl, and the estate, it crumbles. Each syllable was a hammer blow, echoing in the cavernous silence of her chamber. A chill wind, unseen but felt, snaked under the heavy door, raising goosebumps on her arms despite the plush rug beneath her bare feet. She began to pace, a restless phantom in her own opulent prison. The dark wood of the floorboards offered no give beneath her steps, each one a dull thud that mirrored the frantic beating of her heart. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very walls of Ashworth Manor conspired to hold her captive. Moonlight, pale and indifferent, sliced through the tall windows, casting long skeletal shadows across the room, distorting familiar objects into menacing shapes. The expensive damask curtains, usually a comfort, now seemed to mock her with their heavy, unyielding folds. Unwell, her mother had written, a euphemism Eleanor knew for a spirit slowly ebbing away under the strain of poverty and neglect. Her mother, Evelyn, had always been fragile, her kindness a vulnerability in a world that demanded strength. Eleanor closed her eyes, picturing her mother's tired face, the faint lines etched around her once bright blue eyes, now dimmed by sorrow. This image was a constant, searing reminder of why Eleanor endured the daily indignities, the silent contempt, the public humiliations. A wave of despair washed over her, cold and absolute. It was a despair born not of self-pity, but of helplessness, a profound recognition of her own powerlessness. She was a pawn, a sacrifice on the altar of family honor, traded for a temporary reprieve from ruin. The bitter taste of unshed tears coated her tongue, a constant, unwelcome companion. She pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten there, cold and hard as stone. Anger, sharp and hot, followed closely behind the despair. It was a dangerous, forbidden fire that flickered within her, threatening to consume the carefully constructed composure she presented to the world. She was angry at Lady Beatrice, of course, for her relentless cruelty, her petty tyrannies. But deeper, more unsettling, was her anger at Alistair, her husband, for his cold indifference, his vacant eyes, his absolute refusal to see her as anything more than a convenient fixture in his grand, empty life. The faint scent of old beeswax polish from the antique dresser seemed to mock her, a smell of permanence in a life that felt utterly impermanent. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She was a Vance, a name once spoken with reverence, now whispered with pity. Her father, a man of integrity and fierce pride, had faced his own ruin with a stoic silence that had broken Eleanor's heart. She remembered his last days, his strength fading, his once booming voice reduced to a raspy whisper. He had called her to his bedside one afternoon, the late autumn sun filtering weakly through the windows of Vance Hall, painting the dust motes in the air with a melancholy glow. He had taken her hand, his skin papery and thin, his touch surprisingly firm despite his illness. His eyes, so like her own emerald green, had held a desperate, pleading light. "Eleanor," he had rasped, his breath shallow. "My brave girl, you must promise me. You must save your mother. Save our name." His voice had broken then, a raw sound of defeat that had shattered something deep within her. He had not asked her to marry Alistair directly, but the unspoken plea had been clear, a silent burden laid upon her young shoulders. The weight of his expectation, his implicit trust, had been heavier than any command. She could still feel the tremor in his hand, the dampness of his forehead as he had struggled for breath. The faint smell of medicated ointments in old linen had filled the room, the scent of a life slowly ending. She had promised, of course. She would have promised anything to ease the pain in his eyes. She had sworn to him, to herself, to the memory of their proud lineage, that she would do whatever was necessary. That promise was the iron chain binding her to Ashworth Manor, stronger than any lock or guard. It was a sacred vow, whispered in the quiet solemnity of a dying man's room, with the sound of a distant clock ticking away the final moments of their old life. Her father's plea, that memory, was the fuel for her endurance, a constant reminder that her suffering was not her own, but a shield for her mother, a balm for her family's wounded pride. Each fresh insult from Lady Beatrice, each moment of Alistair's chilling indifference, became another stone in the wall she built around her heart, another layer of protection for Evelyn. The taste of duty was a bitter one, yet it was the only sustenance she had in this barren existence. The idea of escape, once a forbidden whisper in the darkest corners of her mind, now pounded with a desperate urgency. Her heart yearned for freedom, a freedom to simply be, to breathe without the crushing weight of expectation and disdain. She imagined herself walking away, out into the cool night, shedding the heavy silks and jewels of her confinement, leaving behind the cold grandeur of Ashworth Manor. She pictured a simple cottage, a small garden, books, perhaps even the quiet companionship of someone who saw her, truly saw her, not as a transaction or an inconvenience. But then her mind would snap back to reality, sharp and brutal. Where would she go? What would she do? Her family, the proud Vances, were destitute. She had no skills, no means, no connections outside of this stifling world. And her mother, the thought of Evelyn, frail and dependent, alone and vulnerable, always slammed the door shut on any dream of escape. She could not abandon her. It would be a betrayal far worse than anything Alistair or his mother could inflict. The very idea was a poison, a self-inflicted wound. The silver locket, always close to her heart, felt heavy against her skin, a cold circle of metal. She unclasped it, opening the tarnished cover to reveal the faded miniature portrait of her father. His kind eyes, his gentle smile, seemed to gaze back at her, a silent question in their depths. Had he known what he was asking of her? Had he foreseen the suffocating loneliness, the relentless chipping away at her spirit? The tiny, almost imperceptible scratch above her left eyebrow, a childhood memory of a fall, felt like a constant throb, a small echo of a larger pain. The room, usually silent, seemed to hum with the echoes of her turmoil. The tapestry on the far wall, depicting a hunting scene, seemed to animate, the hounds eternally chasing their prey, much like her thoughts chased each other in relentless circles. The scent of her own despair seemed to hang heavy in the air, a metallic tang of unshed tears. She longed for the simple sounds of Vance Hall, the creak of old floorboards, the murmur of servants, the distant bark of a beloved deer. Here only the wind sighed outside, a mournful whisper against the glass. A profound weariness settled over her, a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond mere lack of sleep. It was the weariness of a spirit constantly at war with itself, fighting for survival in a battlefield of stifled emotions and shattered dreams. She was utterly trapped, a bird with clipped wings in a gilded cage, watching the free world from behind bars of her own making. The irony was a cruel twist, a bitter laugh in the back of her mind. She had married for freedom from ruin, only to find herself more imprisoned than before. Each passing hour brought with it a fresh wave of agony. She felt like a ship adrift in a stormy sea, tossed about by emotions she could barely contain. One moment, a flicker of defiance, a desperate urge to simply scream, to shatter the suffocating silence. The next, a heavy cloak of resignation, telling her there was no escape, no reprieve, only endless endurance. The texture of the heavy velvet gown, still draped over a chair, felt like a shroud, a symbol of the life she was slowly losing. She imagined Alistair, asleep in his own chamber, perhaps dreaming of estate ledgers or new land acquisitions, utterly oblivious to the tempest raging within his wife. His detachment was a wall, impenetrable and cold. It was not hatred she felt for him, but a deeper, more chilling void of understanding. He saw her as a duty, a means to an end, a suitable vessel for his lineage. She was not a person with hopes, fears, or a heart that ached with 1,000 unspoken words. The night seemed interminable, stretching into an eternity of silent torment. Every tick of the grandfather clock downstairs, a faint chime that echoed through the vast house, was a reminder of time passing, of her life slowly, irrevocably slipping away. The thought brought a fresh wave of nausea. She wanted to claw at the walls, to tear at the heavy drapes, to make some tangible mark of her existence, to prove she was still real, still breathing, still fighting. But even that rebellious urge quickly faded, replaced by the familiar, crushing weight of her obligation. What would her mother do if she broke? If she dared to defy the unspoken rules, to shatter the fragile peace that her sacrifice had bought? The image of Evelyn's despair, her quiet shame, was a potent deterrent. It was a choice between her own dignity and her mother's survival. And for Eleanor, there was no choice at all. Her reflection in the darkened window showed a gaunt face, shadowed eyes, a ghost of her former self. The proud set of her jaw, a trait inherited from her father, was still there, but it was strained, pulled taut by unspoken suffering. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold glass as if trying to reach the woman in the reflection to offer some comfort, some solace. But the glass remained unyielding, a barrier between her and her own image. The silence of the manor pressed in on her, broken only by the occasional creak of old timbers, the rustle of leaves outside, and the insistent rhythm of her own frantic breathing. She felt an overwhelming desire to scream, to shatter the perfect, pristine quiet, to make her pain heard. But the scream remained trapped in her throat, a silent, agonizing pressure, a constant ache behind her eyes. She yearned for the warmth of a fire, the crackle and pop of burning logs, the dancing shadows they cast. But her chamber's hearth was cold, the ashes long swept away by a diligent maid. The coldness seeped into her bones, a physical manifestation of the emotional chill that had become her constant companion. She pulled a thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, seeking a comfort that was nowhere to be found. The hours bled into each other, indistinct and agonizing. The moon slowly traversed the sky, its light fading as the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern horizon a pale, bruised purple. The grand chamber, with all its silent opulence, still felt like a cage, its bars woven from duty, pride, and an unbearable sense of loss. She sank onto the window seat, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind a whirling vortex of fear and resignation. The locket lay open in her palm, her father's face a mute witness to her anguish. She closed her eyes, wishing for unconsciousness, for a brief respite from the relentless torment, but sleep, kind and merciful, refused to claim her. Her throat felt raw, her eyes gritty. Every muscle ached, not from physical exertion, but from the sheer strain of containing so much emotion. The morning light, when it finally arrived, was a cruel awakening, promising another day of pretense, another day of quiet suffering. It was a new day, but it brought no new hope, only the continuation of her silent war. The night passed in a haze of sleepless agony, leaving her with a hollow feeling, a premonition of an impending, unbearable truth that would either break or free her. The chill of the morning air seemed to cling to Eleanor's skin, a constant whisper of the sleepless night she had just endured. Her limbs felt heavy, each step down the grand staircase, an effort that resonated through her weary bones. The premonition from the darkness still lingered, a dull ache behind her eyes, a sense that the fragile balance of her existence within these walls was about to shift. She gripped the polished banister, its cold surface a stark contrast to the burning anxiety inside her. The dining room doors stood open, revealing a tableau that was both familiar and subtly altered. The scent of roasted coffee and warm bread usually offered a fleeting comfort, but this morning it felt suffocating, trapping the unspoken tension within the room's heavy air. Lady Beatrice sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her silver hair impeccably coiled, her posture as rigid as the antique statues that lined the hall. Her gaze, however, was not fixed on her plate, nor on the morning light filtering through the tall windows. It was directed with an unnerving precision at the empty chair awaiting Eleanor. Eleanor felt her jaw tighten, a tiny muscle twitching in defiance. She straightened her spine, forcing the weariness from her expression, adopting the cool, composed mask she wore daily. Her pride, though battered and bruised, refused to let her appear anything less than perfectly indifferent. As she approached her seat, her eyes flickered to Alistair, who was, as always, behind his newspaper, a formidable barrier between himself and the world. But even the rustle of the paper seemed unusually loud, almost brittle, in the profound silence. She slid into her chair, the velvet upholstery doing little to soften the hard edge of her reality. A footman immediately moved to serve her, his movements hushed, almost apologetic. Eleanor noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he poured her coffee, a small detail that spoke volumes. The servants, too, seemed to sense the peculiar atmosphere, their usual efficiency tinged with a nervous hesitancy. Eleanor stirred her coffee slowly, watching the dark liquid swirl, wishing it could dissolve the knot of dread forming in her stomach. Lady Beatrice cleared her throat, a sharp, deliberate sound that cut through the silence like a blade. Eleanor braced herself. She knew the pattern, the subtle digs, the thinly veiled insults woven into polite conversation. But today, the usual veiled hostility felt sharper, more focused, like an arrow aimed directly at her. One must truly appreciate, Lady Beatrice began, her voice perfectly modulated, yet carrying an unusual weight, the immense responsibility that comes with upholding a family name. She paused, taking a delicate sip of her tea, her eyes cold and gray, finally meeting Eleanor's across the expanse of the table. Especially when one marries into a lineage as ancient and respected as the Ashworths. Eleanor's grip on her teacup tightened. The porcelain felt cool and smooth, but her fingers were trembling just slightly. She knew this was a prelude, a deliberate barb intended to remind her of her own family's diminished standing. She met Lady Beatrice's gaze steadily, refusing to flinch, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "Indeed, Lady Beatrice," Eleanor replied, her voice calm and even, betraying none of the turmoil raging within her. She chose her words carefully, a defensive maneuver honed over months of such confrontations. A family name carries the weight of generations, and its preservation is paramount. She tried to imbue her response with a dignity that suggested she fully understood, even embraced the responsibility, deflecting the implied criticism. Lady Beatrice offered a thin, mirthless smile. "Precisely, my dear, and it requires a certain understanding, an innate grasp of decorum, of duty, of what truly constitutes a suitable wife for such a position." The word suitable hung in the air, heavy with unspoken judgment, a thinly veiled accusation that Eleanor was anything but. Eleanor felt a familiar burning sensation rise in her cheeks, a flush of anger and humiliation she fought to suppress. Her mind raced, searching for a neutral, yet firm retort. She considered reminding Lady Beatrice of her own Vance lineage, a name once held in high regard, but knew it would only escalate the conflict without achieving anything. Her father's pride, her family's lost reputation, felt like an open wound, and Lady Beatrice knew exactly where to prod. Then, something unusual happened. Alistair, who had been completely hidden behind his morning paper, lowered it slowly. The sudden movement startled Eleanor, making her jump almost imperceptibly. He did not look at his mother, nor did he offer a comment. Instead, his stern blue eyes fixed directly on Eleanor. His gaze was unsettling, devoid of the usual indifference or vague preoccupation. It held a strange, almost calculating quality, as if he were assessing her, weighing her, dissecting her. It was not anger, nor was it kindness. It was something colder, more analytical, and far more disturbing. Eleanor felt a shiver trace its way down her spine despite herself. His eyes, usually so opaque, seemed to pierce through her carefully constructed facade, stripping away her composure layer by layer. Eleanor felt a sudden tightness in her chest, a difficulty in drawing breath. She tried to return his gaze, to read something, anything in its depths, but found only an unnerving blankness. It was like looking into a still, deep pool where no light penetrated. This was not the dismissive husband she had grown accustomed to, the man who saw her as little more than a necessary fixture in his grand estate. This was different. This was active, engaged observation, and it filled her with a profound sense of unease. The silence that followed Lady Beatrice's words and Alistair's unexpected scrutiny felt impossibly long, stretching thin and taut like a violin string about to snap. The clinking of cutlery from the footmen ceased, as if even they held their breath, caught in the invisible currents of tension. Eleanor could hear the frantic beat of her own heart, a dull thumping against her ribs, echoing in her ears. She tried to focus on the warmth of her coffee cup, on the delicate scent of the roses in the centerpiece, anything to anchor herself in the present and escape the oppressive weight of their combined gazes. Lady Beatrice, observing Alistair's rare engagement, allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smirk to touch her lips. It was a cruel, knowing expression, a sign that she recognized this shift, perhaps even orchestrated it. Her eyes darted from her son to Eleanor, a predator watching her prey, anticipating the kill. She seemed to relish the unfolding drama, the discomfort she had so skillfully manufactured. Eleanor felt a prickle of unease spread through her, a sensation akin to standing on the edge of a precipice. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on her, making her feel small and vulnerable. She longed for the sanctuary of her room, for the quiet solitude where she could drop her guard and allow the tears to fall. But here, under their unblinking scrutiny, she dared not show any weakness. Her father's words about holding one's head high even in adversity echoed in her mind. She focused on her breakfast, cutting a piece of toast with painstaking precision, her movements slow and deliberate. She refused to look up again, convinced that meeting their eyes would only invite further scrutiny, further judgment. Her mind raced, trying to decipher the meaning behind Alistair's sudden, intense observation. Had she done something wrong? Had Lady Beatrice finally pushed him too far? Or was this merely another calculated performance? Another facet of her gilded prison? The taste of the toast was like ash in her mouth, the coffee bitter, the usual comforts of breakfast utterly lost to the growing anxiety. She longed for the days at Vance Hall, for the simple, unpretentious meals shared with her mother, where laughter and genuine affection filled the air, not this cold, calculated silence. The memory brought a pang of deep sorrow, a yearning for a life that was now irrevocably lost to her. She felt the ghost of her father's hand on her shoulder, a phantom comfort that only intensified her resolve. He had always taught her to face challenges with courage, to never let anyone diminish her spirit. But this relentless psychological warfare waged by Lady Beatrice, coupled with Alistair's baffling detachment, was eroding her spirit, piece by painful piece. She was tired, so profoundly tired, of the constant vigilance, the endless performance of being the perfectly indifferent, suitable wife. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Alistair did not speak, nor did he return to his newspaper. He simply watched her, an inscrutable expression on his face that sent shivers down her spine. His silence was more unnerving than any angry outburst. It was the silence of a judge before delivering a sentence, the quiet contemplation before a decisive act. Eleanor felt a cold dread settling deep within her bones. Lady Beatrice, seemingly content with the tension she had created, finally turned her attention back to her own plate, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. But her earlier words about suitable wives and family reputations continued to echo in Eleanor's mind, amplified by Alistair's unsettling gaze. They felt like a prelude to something far more significant, something that threatened to unravel the very fabric of her carefully maintained composure. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment, a fleeting attempt to gather her scattered thoughts, to steel herself against the impending storm. When she opened them again, Alistair was still watching her, his eyes unblinking, unreadable. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if he could see every raw nerve, every hidden wound beneath her composed exterior. Her heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against her ribs, growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. A chilling certainty settled over her, a cold, undeniable truth that permeated her very being. This morning would be different. This day held a turning point, an event that would either break her completely or force her to find a strength she never knew she possessed. Something irrevocable was about to unfold. The clinking of silverware on porcelain felt impossibly loud, a jarring percussion against the frantic beat of Eleanor's own heart. Each tiny scrape seemed to amplify the silence, drawing out the moment before the inevitable clash. She could feel the weight of Lady Beatrice's gaze, a predatory gleam in those sharp gray eyes that promised cruelty. The air in the dining room, usually heavy with the scent of roasted coffee and the faint sweetness of pastries, now carried a bitter tang, like metal on the tongue. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry, a premonition of thirst that no amount of water could quench. Lady Beatrice leaned forward slightly, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips, a gesture of a cat about to toy with its prey. "Tell me, Alistair," she purred, her voice a silken thread. "Why, Eleanor, of all the suitable young ladies in the county, one always wonders about such decisions, does one not?" Her gaze flickered to Eleanor, sharp and knowing, lingering on her pale face. The question was not truly for Alistair. It was a blade aimed directly at Eleanor, meant to dissect her worth in front of her husband. Eleanor felt a hot flush creep up her neck, her hands tightening their grip on the linen napkin in her lap, the fabric crinkling softly under the pressure. Alistair, who had been idly stirring his tea, paused, his spoon clinking against the cup. He looked up, his blue eyes devoid of warmth, sweeping over Eleanor with a detachment that made her feel like an inconvenient piece of furniture. His mother's words seemed to amuse him, a private joke shared between them at Eleanor's expense. He let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, a sound of mild annoyance at having to address something so trivial. Then, with a dismissive wave of his hand as if swatting away a bothersome fly, he spoke. I chose Eleanor because she was ordinary, he stated plainly, his voice flat, emotionless, unproblematic, and would not cause a fuss. The words struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow, stealing the very air from her lungs. Her breath caught in her throat, a sharp, ragged gasp that only she seemed to hear. The opulent dining room with its dark wood paneling and gleaming silver suddenly seemed to spin around her. The rich crimson of the damask wallpaper blurred into an indistinct smear of color. She felt a profound coldness bloom in her chest, spreading rapidly through her veins, chilling her to the bone. Ordinary, unproblematic, would not cause a fuss. Each word was a shard of ice, piercing her pride, not just wounding it, but shattering it into a million irreparable pieces. Her mind reeled, trying to grasp the sheer, brutal truth of his statement. He had spoken of her as if she were a commodity, an item on a checklist, chosen for her lack of distinction, her docile nature. Not for her mind, not for her heart, not even for her lineage, which she had always believed was her one remaining asset. He had chosen her because she was easy, a silent, pliable vessel to carry his name and ensure his succession, nothing more. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she tightened her grip on the table's edge, her knuckles turning white. She thought her world would tilt violently off its axis, throwing her into an abyss of despair. Eleanor had known deep down that his affection was not hers to claim. She understood the transactional nature of their union, a cold bargain made to salvage her family's ruin. But she had clung to a fragile hope, a whisper in the darkest corners of her soul, that perhaps, over time, a modicum of respect, a glimmer of companionship, might emerge. She had believed her quiet strength, her unwavering dignity in the face of Lady Beatrice's relentless barbs, would at least earn her a place of silent, acknowledged worth. But Alistair's words stripped away even that illusion, leaving her exposed and utterly bereft. He saw nothing. He felt nothing. The clinking of silverware had ceased. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth and the ragged thrumming in Eleanor's own ears. Lady Beatrice's smirk had widened into a triumphant, grotesque smile, a silent testament to her victory. She had achieved her goal, watching Eleanor's spirit crumble under the weight of her son's indifference. Eleanor could feel her gaze, a burning brand on her face, but she could not meet it. Her eyes were fixed on the polished mahogany of the table, seeing only her own reflection, distorted and small. A single tear, cold and unwelcome, traced a path down her cheek, leaving a burning trail. She quickly brushed it away, furious at her own weakness, at the betrayal of her composure. She had promised herself, her father, her fading family name, that she would never break. She would endure. She would stand tall. But these words, so casually delivered, had bypassed her defenses entirely, striking directly at the very core of her being, that proud, fragile self she had fought so hard to protect. It was not just an insult, it was an annihilation. The taste in her mouth was of ash and bitter almonds. The aroma of breakfast, once enticing, now felt suffocating. She could barely breathe past the knot of pain in her chest. All the sacrifices, all the swallowed indignities, all the lonely nights spent clutching her locket and yearning for a kindness that never came, now seemed utterly meaningless. They were not just unnoticed, they were actively dismissed. Her entire existence in this house, her entire role as his wife, had been reduced to a mere absence of trouble. She was a void, not a presence. She remembered her father's solemn face, the weight of his final words, urging her to save their legacy. She had carried that burden with unwavering resolve, believing that her suffering here served a higher purpose. But Alistair's callous admission had rendered that purpose hollow. If her value was only in being unproblematic, then her strength, her intelligence, her very essence were not just ignored, they were unwelcome. They were a fuss. She felt a profound sense of humiliation. deeper than any Lady Beatrice had ever managed to inflict. Her fingers, still gripping the napkin, began to tremble uncontrollably. She pressed her lips together, trying to staunch the rising tide of emotion, to regain some semblance of control. The dining room felt enormous, the walls closing in on her, yet simultaneously stretching out into an endless, empty space. She could feel the blood draining from her face, leaving her skin feeling clammy and cold. The silver tea service gleamed mockingly, reflecting the harsh morning light, each glint a reminder of the wealth that had bought her misery. A strange, quiet resolve began to form amidst the chaos in her mind. It was a cold, hard kernel of certainty, born from the ashes of her shattered hope. If she was merely unproblematic, then she had no identity here, no true life. Her presence was purely functional, like an antique clock that kept time but had no soul. Her pride, which had been her shield, had now been utterly demolished, leaving her raw and exposed. But in that utter brokenness, a new fierce clarity began to emerge. The idea of staying, of continuing to exist as this unproblematic ghost, felt suddenly repulsive, a betrayal of everything she was. The thought of another day, another meal, another year under this roof, bearing the weight of his casual disdain, became an impossibility. She had accepted her fate because she believed it was necessary, a sacrifice for her family. But now she saw that her sacrifice was not even acknowledged, only taken for granted, her suffering considered part of the arrangement for being so conveniently ordinary. The silence in the dining room stretched, thick and suffocating. Alistair had returned to his newspaper, the rustle of the pages a sharp counterpoint to the quiet devastation he had wrought. Lady Beatrice continued to watch Eleanor, her eyes alight with malevolent satisfaction. Eleanor could feel their combined weight, the invisible chains of their expectations, tightening around her. But something had shifted. The chains, though still present, no longer held the same power. Her heart, which had been pounding erratically moments before, now settled into a slow, deliberate rhythm, a strange, steady drumbeat of defiance. The pain was still a raw, open wound, but beneath it, a strength she had not known she possessed began to stir. Her vision cleared, the blurred crimson walls sharpening into focus. She saw the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, the tiny flaws in the polished silver, the intricate patterns on the expensive china. Everything was painfully clear. She had endured humiliation before, countless times, always telling herself it was for her mother, for the Vance name. She had built walls around her pride, believing they would protect her. But Alistair had found the one true weakness, not with cruelty, but with absolute, unfeeling indifference. He had shown her that her pride, her struggles, her very essence were invisible to him, and that, more than any insult, was the ultimate degradation. It was as if she did not exist. But if she did not exist in his eyes, then she was free. Free from the burden of trying to please him, free from the crushing weight of his silent judgment, free from the futile hope of ever earning his respect. The thought was terrifying, exhilarating, and deeply liberating all at once. The world had indeed tilted, but it had not shattered her entirely. It had broken her open, revealing a core of pure, unyielding will. The words echoed in the sudden silence of the dining room, searing Eleanor's soul, extinguishing the last flicker of hope, and leaving her utterly shattered, yet strangely resolute. The stark silence in the dining room felt heavier than the weight of the Ashworth name itself, pressing down on Eleanor, stifling the very air in her lungs. Alistair's words had not just echoed, they had reverberated through her very core, shattering something fragile she had not even known remained. Ordinary, unproblematic, would not cause a fuss. His voice, devoid of any warmth, replayed itself, a cruel, mocking lullaby in her mind. She felt a cold, spreading numbness, as if every nerve ending in her body had suddenly recoiled from the brutal impact. Her fingers, still wrapped around the porcelain handle of her teacup, tightened with an unconscious, desperate strength. She knew if she let go now, the delicate china would splinter against the polished table, a small, violent rebellion she could not afford. The scent of coffee and sizzling bacon. Moments before a comforting morning ritual, now turned acrid, clinging to the back of her throat. A wave of nausea rolled over her, threatening to betray her composure. She felt, rather than saw, Lady Beatrice's triumphant smirk, a silent, venomous confirmation of her victory. The older woman's cold gray eyes, she imagined, would be piercing her, savoring this moment of utter demolition. Eleanor's jaw tightened, a muscle throbbing beneath her ear. For years she had endured the relentless barbs, the veiled insults, the casual dismissals. She had swallowed her pride, bitten her tongue, worn her mask of stoic indifference, all for the sake of her family, for her mother. She had accepted her role as the silent, dutiful wife, the acceptable lineage, the necessary sacrifice. But Alistair's words, spoken with such casual cruelty, had ripped through the fabric of her endurance. He had not merely insulted her, he had diminished her entire existence, reducing her to a mere commodity, a convenient absence of trouble. He had confirmed that her very essence, her spirit, her dreams, held no value in his world. She was simply a quiet space, a blank page to be ignored. The realization was a sharp, piercing pain, far worse than any of Lady Beatrice's direct assaults. A strange, quiet fury began to simmer deep within her, a heat rising to replace the initial cold shock. It started as a tiny spark, then grew, spreading like wildfire through her veins. This fury was not loud or explosive. It was a silent, unyielding burn, cleansing and hardening. Ordinary. The word itself tasted like ash in her mouth. She had been anything but ordinary in her past. A vibrant girl with a sharp mind and an adventurous spirit, stifled by circumstance. And now she was being told her ultimate value was her lack of distinction. The air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating, yet through it, a clarity began to emerge. A profound weariness, an exhaustion that settled deep into her bones, told her she could not bear this burden for another moment. The thought of enduring another breakfast, another day, another year under this roof, under their dismissive gazes, filled her with a terror far greater than any uncertainty the outside world could offer. Her duty to her family, a weight she had carried faithfully, suddenly felt like a chain forged by her own hand, binding her to a slow, agonizing death of the spirit. No, not anymore. The single, resolute thought hammered in her mind, rhythmic and powerful. No more, more. A quiet defiance, utterly unshakable, took root. She felt a shift within her, a fundamental reordering of priorities. Her father's memory, the locket she so often clutched, they had anchored her to her past, to her obligations. But now they would anchor her to herself. Her pride, her most defining characteristic, had been wounded, yes, but not destroyed. It was now rising, not as defensiveness, but as a fierce, protective shield. Eleanor slowly, deliberately placed her teacup back on its saucer. The gentle click of porcelain against porcelain sounded impossibly loud in the hushed room. The movement was a small, almost imperceptible tremor, but it was the first deliberate action she had taken since Alistair's words had fallen. She felt her mom, steady and unblinking, lift from the table. She did not look at Alistair, whose eyes were likely already back on his newspaper, his moment of callous honesty forgotten. She did not look at Lady Beatrice, whose triumphant smile, she knew, would be etched onto her features. Instead, Eleanor looked straight ahead, at the ornate fireplace, at the cold, unlit hearth. She drew a slow, deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs, a tangible act of reclaiming her space, herself. Her hands, released from the teacup, found the edge of the heavy oak table. Her fingertips brushed against the cold, polished wood, a stark sensation that grounded her. The decision, once a distant, impossible whisper in the dark hours of night, was now a roaring certainty, burning away all doubt. Her mind, usually a whirl of conflicting emotions and calculated endurance, had become singularly focused. She would reclaim her dignity. She would not be an ordinary, unproblematic wife. She would be Eleanor Vance, and she would be free. The cost, she knew, would be immense. It would mean tearing down the carefully constructed life she had built, however fragile and unhappy it was. It would mean facing an uncertain future, a future without the Ashworth name, without the manor's formidable walls. It would mean the possibility of bringing further hardship upon her mother, a thought that still twisted her gut with a familiar ache. But the alternative, the endless continuation of this slow, spiritual suffocation, was no longer an option. It was a death she would not choose. With a strength she hadn't realized she possessed, Eleanor pushed her heavy chair back. The scrape of its legs against the polished floorboards was a sharp, jarring sound, a small rebellion that pierced the dining room's oppressive silence. Both Alistair and Lady Beatrice, she knew, would have looked up then, startled by the sudden, unprecedented disruption. She felt their eyes on her, two pairs of cold, assessing gazes, but she kept her own focus unwavering, directed straight ahead. Her face, she imagined, was pale, perhaps even stark, but it was no longer shadowed by despair. Instead, a fierce, cold determination had settled upon her features, sharpening her emerald eyes, tightening the line of her lips. She could feel the faint tremor in her legs as she rose, but she ignored it, willing her body to obey the command of her newly awakened spirit. The thick, heavy fabric of her dress rustled around her, a whisper of sound that seemed to declare her presence. She did not glance at the spread of food, the untouched plate before her, the half-empty coffee cup. The thought of consuming another bite of anything in this house, under these circumstances, was utterly repugnant. The smell of roasted meats and sweet preserves, once appealing, now felt cloying, sickening. She simply stood, a slender figure silhouetted against the morning light that streamed through the tall windows, a silent challenge in the face of their indifference and cruelty. Every nerve ending was alight, every sense acutely aware. The faint scent of old wood polish and distant cooking from the kitchens, the muted clatter of cutlery from the servants' quarters, the almost imperceptible hum of the manor house itself, all these details, usually background noise, now felt sharp, vivid, as if she were seeing and hearing them for the very last time. And indeed she was. She began to walk. Each step was deliberate, unhurried, yet filled with a potent, unyielding purpose. The thick pile of the Persian rug beneath her feet felt strangely alien, no longer a familiar softness, but a barrier she was traversing, a path she was leaving behind. She walked past the long table, past Alistair's silent, preoccupied form, past Lady Beatrice's undoubtedly smirking face. She did not look at them, did not acknowledge their existence. Their words had ceased to matter. Their opinions had ceased to hold power over her. The initial shock of Alistair's words had now completely receded, replaced by a clear, unwavering resolve that hardened her every fiber. This was not an act of impulsive anger, though anger had certainly fueled its birth. This was a decision forged in the crucible of years of humiliation, solidified by an ultimate betrayal. Her internal monologue, once a tormented ballet of despair and obligation, had transformed into a singular, powerful declaration. I will not be broken. I will not be diminished. Her heart, which had pounded with fear and sadness for so long, now beat with a steady, strong rhythm, a drumbeat of defiance. It was a daunting path she was choosing, one fraught with unknowns and certain difficulties. The very ground beneath her feet felt both solid and uncertain, a precipice she was willingly stepping over. But there was also a profound sense of liberation, a lightness that began to unfurl within her, like wings long bound finally stretching open. With each step away from the table, a new, daunting but liberating path solidified in her mind, a path she knew she must now walk, utterly alone if necessary. The cold resolve that had settled in Eleanor's veins after Alistair's cruel words was an unfamiliar, potent sensation. It was not the burning anger that had often consumed her, nor the quiet despair that had been her constant companion. This was a clear, sharp certainty, a singular purpose finally etched into her soul. Her feet, which had carried her from the dining room with such surprising steadiness, now felt grounded, each step deliberate. She moved through the silent, echoing corridors of Ashworth Manor, the grand tapestries and ornate furniture suddenly seeming less impressive, more like the elaborate trappings of a gilded cage she was about to abandon. Her first act was swift, born of instinct. She found Martha, a quiet, trustworthy maid who sometimes brought her tea in the evenings. Eleanor's voice was low, firm, devoid of the usual weariness. Martha, I need you to send a message. A carriage must go to Vance Hall immediately. My mother, Mrs. Evelyn Vance, must be brought here without delay. Martha's eyes widened slightly, startled by the urgency in Eleanor's tone, but she simply nodded, her hand already moving to smooth her apron. Eleanor pressed on, her gaze steady. "Tell her it is urgent, a matter of family importance. And Martha, this must be done discreetly. No word to Lady Beatrice, no word to anyone else." Martha's face remained impassive, but her understanding was clear. She dipped a quick curtsy and vanished down a servant's passage, leaving Eleanor alone in the vast, still hallway. A breath she had not realized she was holding escaped her lips, a small, quiet exhalation. The silence of the manor, usually so oppressive, now felt like an accomplice, holding its breath with her. She turned towards her chambers, the grand staircase stretching before her like a path to liberation. Each step upward was a step away from the woman she had been, the woman who had quietly absorbed every slight, every dismissive glance. Her fingers brushed the smooth cold banister, a physical anchor in the swirling tempest of her resolve. Inside her room, the opulent furnishings, once a source of bitter irony, now held no power over her. The heavy silk drapes, the intricately carved bed, the polished wardrobe filled with gowns she never truly desired. They were mere objects, shells of a life that was never truly hers. She walked directly to her large cedar chest, pulling out a plain, sturdy travel bag, one she had brought from Vance Hall herself. It was simple, unadorned, a stark contrast to the Ashworth finery. Her hands moved with an efficiency born of a mind made up. She chose only what was essential, what held true meaning. 3 practical day dresses, 2 nightgowns, her worn leather boots, and a heavy wool cloak. The silk and satin, the pearls and diamonds, the elaborate hats all remained. They were symbols of her imprisonment, of the price of her marriage. Leaving them felt like shedding a heavy skin, a physical act of severing the ties to this unwanted life. Her mother's small, embroidered handkerchief, tucked away in a drawer, went into the bag. A worn copy of her favorite poetry book, its pages soft from countless readings, followed. Then her fingers instinctively sought the locket, warm against her skin, the only true treasure she possessed. She unclasped it, opening the tiny silver doors to reveal her father's faded miniature portrait, his kind eyes smiling back at her. A pang of raw grief, sharp and sudden, tightened her chest. It was for him, for his memory, that she had endured. And now it was for him, for his honor, that she was leaving. The locket was not merely an item, it was the physical embodiment of her lineage, her pride, her very self. She secured it carefully in an inner pocket of the travel bag, a silent promise to carry her true heritage with her. She closed the bag, the soft click of the clasp echoing in the vast room. It was surprisingly light, easy to carry. The lightness in her hands mirrored a lightness in her spirit, a fragile bud of hope unfurling after a long, brutal winter. She moved to the window, gazing out at the manicured gardens, the distant stables, the sprawling, indifferent grounds of Ashworth Manor. This place had been a gilded cage, a tomb for her spirit. Now it was just a house, a place she was about to leave behind forever. The thought sent a thrill, cold and exhilarating through her. Time stretched, each minute feeling like an hour. The wait for her mother was agonizing, a delicate dance between unwavering resolve and a creeping fear that something would go wrong. What if Martha was intercepted? What if Lady Beatrice discovered her plan before Mrs. Vance arrived? A tremor ran through Eleanor, but she pushed it down, her jaw tightening. No, this was her moment. She would not falter. She paced the length of her chamber, her hands clasped tightly, her mind replaying Alistair's words, each one a fresh lash that solidified her decision. Ordinary, unproblematic, would not cause a fuss. She would cause a fuss, a profound, undeniable fuss. Hours passed, the afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the walls of her room in hues of gold and orange. Then, a soft knock at her door. It was Martha again, her face still impassive but her eyes holding a flicker of something close to admiration. "Your mother has arrived, Miss Eleanor. She is in the small parlor awaiting you." A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled her knees, washed over Eleanor. She nodded, her voice steady despite the sudden surge of emotion. "Thank you, Martha. Please ensure our carriage is ready at the side entrance. Discreetly. We will be leaving shortly." Martha gave another quick curtsy and left. Eleanor took one last look around her chambers, at the lavish bed she had rarely shared with Alistair, at the vanity where she had often sat, staring at her own reflection, a stranger in her own life. There was no sadness, no lingering attachment, only a profound sense of finality. She picked up her travel bag, its familiar weight of comfort, and walked out, closing the door softly behind her. The sound was barely audible, yet in her mind it was the definitive click of a lock, sealing away a chapter she was desperate to forget. She found her mother in the small, rarely used parlor, a room designed for intimate conversations, now filled with a palpable tension. Mrs. Vance sat on a velvet armchair, her hands clasped in her lap, her usually gentle face etched with worry. "Eleanor, my dear, what is it? Martha said it was urgent. Is everything well?" Her mother's voice was soft, laced with a familiar anxiety. Eleanor knelt before her, taking her mother's trembling hands in her own. Her emerald eyes, usually guarded, now held a fierce, tender light. "Mother, we are leaving, today. Now." Mrs. Vance's eyes widened, a fragile teacup rattling in its saucer on the nearby table. "Leaving? But, Eleanor, what do you mean? Leaving for where?" "Leaving Ashworth Manor, Mother," Eleanor stated, her voice calm, unwavering. "Leaving this place, this life. For good." She recounted in brief, direct sentences Alistair's words at breakfast, the searing humiliation, the final, undeniable truth that had broken something within her, only to forge something new and unbreakable. She spoke of her pride, her spirit, how it had been crushed, but now had risen, demanding freedom. Mrs. Vance listened, her face paling, her eyes welling with unshed tears. She understood the weight of dignity, the profound pain of such a public, casual dismissal. Her own spirit, though often bowed by hardship, recognized the fire in her daughters. When Eleanor finished, a quiet sob escaped Mrs. Vance's lips, not of despair, but of a shared, aching relief. "Oh, my dear girl," she whispered, pulling Eleanor into a tight embrace. "Yes, yes, we must. Anywhere but here." Eleanor felt her mother's frail body tremble against hers, a silent affirmation, a shared understanding that transcended words. This was not a rash decision, but a liberation. She helped her mother to her feet. "Come, Mother, our carriage awaits." Together they walked towards the main entrance, Mrs. Vance leaning slightly on Eleanor's arm, her steps still a little unsure. The grand hall loomed, vast and imposing, as if trying to swallow them whole. But Eleanor felt no fear, only a determined stride. As they approached the heavy oak doors, a familiar, sharp voice cut through the air. "And where, pray tell, are you two going?" Lady Beatrice Ashworth stood at the foot of the grand staircase, a formidable figure in a dark silk gown. Her gray eyes, cold and piercing, narrowed first on Eleanor's travel bag, then on her mother's anxious face. Her lips, usually set in a thin, disdainful line, now curled into a sneer. "Running away, are we? After all the trouble I went to for your pathetic family?" Eleanor stopped, her back straightening, her shoulders squaring. She did not speak. She simply turned her head slowly, her emerald eyes meeting Lady Beatrice's. There was no anger in her gaze, no fear, no pleading. There was only a profound, chilling emptiness, a quiet, unyielding resolve that spoke volumes. It was the look of a woman utterly emancipated, a soul finally set free from invisible chains. In that silent, searing exchange, Eleanor conveyed everything: the years of endured humiliation, the casual cruelty, the final unforgivable insult, and the absolute, irrevocable end of her suffering. Lady Beatrice flinched, a flicker of genuine shock crossing her face. For the first time, her cutting words seemed to fall on deaf ears, her powers suddenly rendered impotent. She saw not the cowed, proud bride she had relentlessly tormented, but a stranger, a woman whose spirit she had tried to break, only to forge it into something stronger, colder, and utterly beyond her control. Eleanor held the gaze for a long moment, allowing the silence to stretch, to settle like an unseen judgment between them. Then slowly, deliberately, she turned away, breaking the connection. She pulled open one of the heavy oak doors, the massive wood groaning softly in protest. The crisp, cool air of the outside world, tinged with the scent of damp earth and distant pines, rushed into the stagnant air of the manor, a breath of pure, untainted freedom. She helped her mother into the waiting carriage, a modest closed vehicle, far less ostentatious than the Ashworth conveyances. As Mrs. Vance settled onto the cushioned seat, Eleanor turned for one last glimpse of the manor. Lady Beatrice remained frozen at the foot of the staircase, a solitary, furious statue. Eleanor felt nothing, no triumph, no regret, no lingering bitterness, only a deep, cleansing peace. Then she stepped into the carriage, the door closing behind her with a soft, decisive click. The driver, a kind-faced man, gave a gentle nod and clicked his reins. The horses stirred and the carriage began to move on, slowly at first, then picking up speed. Eleanor leaned back, her mother's hand finding hers, a comforting presence. She did not look back. Not once, Vom. The world outside the carriage window was a blur of trees, fields, and sky, a vast, open canvas for a future yet unwritten. The heavy oak doors of Ashworth Manor closed behind them with a resounding thud, severing the ties that had bound Eleanor to her gilded cage, and opening to an uncertain, yet free, future. The carriage wheels turned with a rhythmic sigh, pulling them away from Ashworth Manor. Eleanor sat upright, the locket cold in her palm. Mrs. Vance, fragile beside her, seemed overwhelmed by the sudden upheaval. Outside, through the dusty window, greens and browns blurred past. Each tree marked their escape. Silence filled the carriage, broken only by hooves and sway. It was a silence heavy with questions, a broken past, and an unknown future. Lady Beatrice's smirk still chilled Eleanor, fueling her resolve. Her breath hitched, not in fear, but from the audacity of her actions. The carriage air felt lighter, cleaner than Ashworth Manor's suffocating walls. She inhaled deeply, damp earth and wood smoke replacing the stale, polished air of her gilded cage. Mrs. Vance stirred, her soft sigh barely audible. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice fragile, "what have we done?" Her wide, bewildered eyes found Eleanor's face. Eleanor took her mother's trembling hand, intertwining their fingers firmly. It was an anchor in the uncertainty. She felt the delicate bones, a reminder of burdens carried and new responsibilities embraced. "We have reclaimed ourselves, Mother," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite her warring emotions. She saw not just fear in her mother's eyes, but a glimmer of nascent hope. "We chose dignity over gilded servitude. We chose freedom." The words felt like a balm, a declaration to herself as much as to her mother. Their raw, honest taste was almost unfamiliar. A tear traced Mrs. Vance's pale cheek, not of despair. "But where will we go? What will we do?" She trembled, practical fears surfacing. Eleanor squeezed her hand, a wave of fierce protective love washing over her. She had let others dictate her path for too long. This new, unwritten path would be hers alone. "We will find a place," Eleanor said, her gaze steady on the softening evening road. A small cottage, perhaps, in a quiet country town, away from that life's cruelties. She painted a future she had only dared to dream of. "I can teach needlework, perhaps languages. You, Mother, with your exquisite embroidery, could share your skills." A humble, honest existence began to take shape in her mind, built on their own labor. Mrs. Vance listened, comprehension slowly dawning in her eyes. Hay and lavender sachet scents grounded Eleanor. Her mother's shoulders eased, her grip loosened. It was a profound victory. This was not destitution. It was self-reliance. It was a choice. "We will not be rich, Mother," Eleanor continued, her voice soft, "but we will be free. We will own our days, our thoughts, our breath." She imagined a small, sunlit room, simple furniture, a quiet rhythm free from judgment. Alistair's cold words, his casual dismissal, still stung. Now they fueled her resolve, hardening it into an unbreakable core. His unproblematic assessment became a catalyst, not a wound. Mrs. Vance's gaze softened, a fragile smile on her lips. "Free," she whispered, testing the unfamiliar word. The concept, long denied, bloomed between them. Eleanor saw a glimpse of the spirited woman her mother once was, before grief and ruin stole her light. For years, anxiety had knotted in her chest, Now a genuine peace settled. The weight of Ashworth Manor, its grandeur and rules, lifted from her shoulders. Darkness gathered as the carriage reached a small country town. Cool, crisp air carried a distant church bell and evening murmurs. Warm light spilled from the traveler's rest, its sign creaking. The aroma of fresh bread and stew promised comfort. Eleanor stepped onto the cobblestones, her boots making a soft thud. Solid ground grounded her, a concrete reality after the manor's unreality. She helped her mother alight. Their eyes met in shared understanding. This was their new beginning. Inside, the inn was warm, bustling with conversation and clattering plates. The innkeeper, a stout woman with a cinnamon flushed face, greeted them with warmth. Her smile contrasted Lady Beatrice's sneer. Eleanor requested a simple room, a strange lightness in her voice, a new confidence she had not known. Their room was small, clean, with a roaring fire casting shadows across plain wooden furniture. Wildflowers on the bedside table scented the air. Eleanor helped her mother settle in, her movements precise. The long journey, physical and emotional, left her exhausted, but with a profound sense of accomplishment. Later, Mrs. Vance slept. Eleanor sat by the window gazing at the quiet, starlit town. This silence was different, not heavy with resentment, but soft and peaceful. She held the locket, no longer a burden, but a link to her father's independent spirit she now honored. Alistair's careless words had wounded her pride, but now it was fiercely reborn. It was pride forged in defiance, polished by resilience, and strengthened by commitment to herself and her mother. The future stretched unknown, unwritten, but theirs to shape, free from expectation and wealth's tyranny. Morning sun streamed through the simple window, painting golden stripes on the floor. Eleanor felt pride reborn, a future unwritten, and the sweet taste of true freedom.